And today I'm very much happy to introduce Liz Beaven, who is from San Francisco, and she has a BA and MA from University of Auckland in New Zealand, and has been a long time class teacher in the US. And she worked also a long time for the very well-known California Institute for Integral Studies. Maybe you can put in the link into the chat, Lisa, when you find it. And right from 2022 now, she is the executive director at the Alliance for Public School Waldorf Education. And so very experienced around Waldorf with a long lifetime experience. And she's going to speak today about the importance of place in Waldorf education today. And I like that topic very much. I'm keen to hear what you're going to present about it. Thank you so much for contributing. And please start your lecture, Liz.
Thank you, Joost. And hello, good morning, good evening, good early morning, good afternoon, which I think in itself is a picture of this topic. So it's a real pleasure to do this. I'm a little bit nervous because I consider after almost 40 years in this work in various roles that I am fairly experienced but not expert. And I said to Joost, quite a bit of what I'm bringing today is work in process, thoughts, questions, and some observations that pretty much come out of practice. So I'm going to explain a little bit more of my own relationship to location in a moment. And I have prepared slides that I've realized are quite American because in this country we like a lot of visual stimulation. So I would say that I am very much bringing this from a United States perspective. I will try to link it beyond that, but that is where most of my experience of Waldorf education comes from, is this vast, complicated country. So Lisa, if we could start the slides. My understanding, and I am happy to be corrected, is that what we are trying to do in Waldorf education as a global education movement is to really look at the needs of students based on our coherent picture of the human being and of human development and situate them in this time. Obviously, we are looking towards the future and in a place. And one of my questions today is, how well are we doing with that, the last part of that? I think we've done a lot of work on students, and I think we have actually, certainly in this century, been looking at a lot of the questions of time, and they overlap into place. Next slide. So I was intrigued by the overarching topic of this, what can we do better, and this idea of transformation. This is pretty much coming out of my observations in schools. In my job with the Alliance for Public Waldorf Education, I go into a lot of schools in a lot of different settings. And I do not believe what I am saying here is unique to the United States, but we are seeing real challenges for our young people, for the teaching profession, Waldorf and more broadly, and I'm going to argue for schools themselves. In this country, at least, we've had huge increases in the rise of students who need individual approaches to learning. Dysregulation, autism disorders, spectrum disorders, mental health concerns such as depression, anxiety, suicidality. We have a teaching profession that is not bringing in enough people to match the people going out. And we have teachers who are increasingly reporting that they are stressed and feel overwhelmed, in part by those signs of distress in the students and in part by social conditions and a lack of resources. So we have a teaching cadre under stress, and then taking it further with this, what can we do better, and maybe what do we need to transform, questions in schools themselves. In this country, at least, and I would be interested to know whether it's just this country, we have seen a rise in opting out of school as we know it. Alternatives, a big increase in homeschooling, which has always been part of the landscape in this country. Things that we call micro schools or pods, that are small groups with a teacher or parents, outside of formal school. It's interesting when you look at that in the Waldorf context. Sometimes it's because they say they want more anthroposophy or something that is more Waldorf. We spend a lot of time here arguing about what is Waldorf and what is not. But this rise in alternatives, less confidence, I would say, in this thing called school, and so less willingness to stay the course over a number of years. My child is not happy, I will leave and try something different. So less rootedness in a school, in a system that is childhood is slow and Waldorf education is slow. So less patience, and just this growing question of students who don't fit. And along with this question of schools, and I will come back to this, this now starts to really challenge our idea of a classroom. What do we do when we have a good percentage of a class that needs individual services, individual support, that has trouble with following the norms of a classroom? At what point does our approach of a class, our model of a class, actually break down? And I wonder whether we are at some kind of tipping point, at least in this country. And then along with this question of school as we know it, this is a personal observation, but I believe for a number of valid reasons that certainly in this century, we are seeing two things in this country. One, that the independent schools, I believe, have gone more towards a mainstream identity, and I can explain why if needed. Meanwhile, the schools that are inspired by Waldorf education, based on Waldorf education in the public sector, and we have 61 of those right now, are of course trying to move with as much space from the mainstream as possible so that they have more space for Waldorf education. So that's just an observation of where I think we are right now. And that took me to this question of, well, what can we do better? Where are we seeing success? What do we need to change? So next slide, please. And just to situate this a little more, I'm talking about several things here. One is location, which is where are we on a map? The other is place, which I am defining much more as how do we relate to where we are on a map. Human geography, which is the human's interaction with the environment. It includes history, economics, sociology, anthropology, politics, etc. And this idea, which I will talk about later, a little more about the genius loci, or the spirit of a place, and how does that impact our schools. Another couple of things in framing this, I think we need to look historically. We've had enormous changes as human beings over very few generations to our understanding of the physical world, our knowledge, our direct knowledge of the world. I read one survey that said there's been a tenfold exponential increase over 4 generations in the area traveled. And that pre-industrial revolution, it was about the known world for most people was about 25 miles from home. Then 250 to 40 kilometers, 400, 4,000, 40,000. And I would suspect that most of us on this call today have already clocked up far more than 40,000 kilometers of direct experience of things other than home. Which leads to the question then of what is home? We see that with technology, our local connections are weaker, something that is often called the collapse of geographical space, which makes things like these Zoom meetings possible, that we can be in direct contact with people from all over the world. But along with that, we have a feeling of instability and loss of connection. And of course, part of the movement that we experience now can come from the privilege of tourist travel, business travel. And of course, many of our children in many of our schools here at least travel. They can go to other places because their parents have the means to do so. But we need to also keep in mind the instability coming from migration, refugees, wars, disasters, etc. So we have a lot of movement, a lot of instability around with this question of what is place. And I hope we can look a little bit at, so, okay, as this education has spread globally, what is that requiring of us in terms of place, and how well are we meeting that requirement? So this question of where are we seeing success with these needs in the classroom, with these needs of the young people today, with the future pressing on us? What have we already got in Waldorf education that is very effective? And my question here is, if we have it, are we using it sufficiently? Are we confident enough, bold enough in the tools that are really embedded in Waldorf education? Things like the arts, crafts, our holistic image of the human being, space for development, the need for time, relationships to others, to the world, to nature. Are we in fact in some ways being Waldorf enough, especially with this picture I presented on the last slide, with maybe a bit of a move here towards more mainstream practices. And so for me personally, going into classrooms, looking at some of the children, wondering how I would cope day after day in a classroom right now, what tools do we need to use more? Looking for things that maybe will speak to us in a different way, things that are outside the box, outdoor education, project-based education, more movement education. And this led for me to Ruskin Mill. And I just want to note that this is at least the third time that the work of Angus Gordon and Ruskin Mill has been mentioned in this series. So perhaps there is something here for us to take a look at. So I managed, I had worked with Angus a tiny bit in this country, and then earlier this year I went to Ruskin Mill and spent just a very short time there. So I am not an expert, but I am intrigued, and I think there are some clues there. And I just popped the name of his book, he and Lawrence Cox, which came out this year, which is worth a read in my opinion. So I'd like us now to switch gear just a little bit, and I'm going to invite you to be Californians for a moment. So next slide, please. Because, of course, we know that Steiner says we must start and continuously return to the educator, the teacher. What are we bringing into the classroom in terms of our worldview, our understanding, etc.? So starting with the educator, if we are working with place and trying to deepen our connection to place, we need to understand our own sense of place. So we have a biography, I believe, of place. And some of the things I would like you to think about for yourselves, just for a moment, as I said, be Californian, be New Age, focus on yourselves. Where am I from? This is actually the name of a poetry exercise that we is often done with high school students and young adults. Where am I from? What has formed my sense of place? What is my ancestry, my history? Do I live where I was born? Do I live in the same country as my birth? How much have I traveled? Do I live and work in the same community, or am I commuting, which is very common in this country, that teachers drive in to schools, often because of where they're located, they can't afford to live right next to them. How much do I really know about local conditions, the geology, the plants, the animals, the human history, the culture? What do I call home? And how is this shrinking world, this collapsing geography, Zoom, international travel and communication, affecting my sense of place? So think about those just for a moment for yourself. Locate yourself in space. Next slide, Lisa. And this very briefly is my progression through countries. Born and raised in early education in New Zealand. I always wear a little piece of New Zealand on me. It is home. And from New Zealand, I believe that I got my formative forces, my initial education, a strong connection to nature, a love of the sky, and an awareness of nature and practical thinking. Then a decade in England where my children were born, the culture that, funnily enough, I grew up with in a colony, a colonial culture, strong human influence. New York was interestingly where I encountered anthroposophy and Waldorf education. but a deeply urban environment. And then on to Sacramento and San Francisco in California, where I encountered wide open spaces, intense light, heat in Sacramento. And if I look at my own progression, I see that no matter where I go, someone will ask me where I am from, because I am now a hybrid of these places and influences. And I stand both inside and outside of a place, which has advantages and disadvantages. So biography of place is partly formed, our sense of place, partly formed by where we have lived and do live in the conditions. And next slide. And is developmental. So we know that we pick up in a formal way local geography in around grade 4, class 4, 4th grade. But actually we can see, and the developmental psychologists tell us, that a sense of location and place actually starts very early. This was drawn by a 3-year-old, and she is very clear that it is a map. One of those dots is on the left is her home, and there are pathways for her daddy to drive in the car to her one to 2 different cousins and to the store, and she can tell quite coherently. Now, to be fair, many children see GPS in cars, but there was clearly an idea of here and there and movement. We know that a sense of place, a sense of being located, really contributes to an early sense of well-being and to security. So it's in those foundational sense of needs that Maslow talks about. We know, I believe, that this is one area where we have real strength in Waldorf education, where we have a very coherent way of widening the child's horizons, of going from home surroundings to local to broader. Our studies of botany and insects and animals, going into the earth with geology and mineralogy as they get older, and eventually encompassing the entire globe, reaching out to the stars, center of the earth to out in the stars. So we know that we have a really coherent, clear pathway in geography. We also know that Steiner emphasized the importance of the teaching of geography, stating that it helps our students to understand the relationship between humans and the earth and to understand human culture and history. And he pointed out that this study needs to be deeply connected to place. So just hold that thought. I would also suggest, and our trauma-informed pedagogy shows, that a sense of place and being rooted in place is an antidote to anxiety. It's a balance to anxiety. It is reassuring and assuring. And so we have an important tool here. Next slide. My journey then took me a little bit, and this is a journey that is far from finished, to this question of place-based education and our need in this time for environmental education, for ensuring that the children, our students, have a secure primary relationship to place and a warm connection. We also know, as I've pointed out already, that it's really hard to maintain this connection to what is right around us in an age of technology, the compelling presence of the screen that can take us immediately far away from where we are and keep us there. I may be only speaking for myself with a weak will, but keep us there for far longer than we plan. So how do we build, David Sobel, who is one of the leaders in place-based education and environmental education, a leading voice in this country, how do we build these meaningful connections with the natural world? He says, along with our Waldorf curriculum, so we're walking side by side, he says they begin in our backyards, right at home. And that local experience is this foundational source of our knowledge of the world. This seems to me to be a very, very important topic right now. I am seeing something that has me a little bit worried. And again, it may just be the schools I'm going into in this country. But we are dealing with climate and future anxiety to quite a significant extent. And I think we have to go back to that question of the development of a sense of place and ask ourselves, when is it appropriate to take the children into questions of existential concern about the future, of climate concern, knowing that in this country, and I suspect in many other places, I don't suspect, I know, this is no longer an abstract question because children are directly experiencing fires, floods, major weather events, and of course they are hearing adults talking. I think we have to be careful to not scare them before we ground them. And so giving them this early place-based experience, which is very much in our curriculum, rather than having the concerns from well-meaning adults terrifying them before that is in place. I would also say that place-based education directly engaged in our immediate environment, actively engaged, activates the will. There is a lot of possibility for the will, for having an impact on a place, for using the materials to play, etc. And so through place-based education, located education, we are providing a sense of meaning and order to children. We are giving them agency, and we are providing this rather than overwhelm and despair with what they are going to be navigating as they walk into the future. I hope that makes sense to us, but really beginning with locating the children in place and building from there. Okay, now we're going to move to schools. And again, I will remind you my examples are from this country. So next slide. What is the impact of place now that we turn to schools? And these were my two bookends in my work as a teacher and then as a school administrator. On the left, you can see the oldest school in this country, the Rudolf Steiner School. It opens directly onto a New York street, and Fifth Avenue, which is a big thoroughfare, is literally less than half a block here. And to get the children outside, you walk across Fifth Avenue into Central Park, which luckily is right nearby, as is the Metropolitan Museum, if you know New York, right around the corner. So you can do a fantastic, quick fifth grade trip around to the Metropolitan Museum to see some ancient examples of ancient culture. But it is very much a city school. I did my initial training there. I interned there. I took a class for 3 years, and then for a variety of reasons, I moved to the school on the right, which is the Sacramento Waldorf School, where there is a vast expanse of land, 23 acres, I think, a working farm. It overlooks a large river, and the climate is very, very different. So for me, early in my career, I had this question of what am I seeing here? Because a lot of what I had been taught to do and did in New York did not fit the conditions of Sacramento. And it was not just the straightforward question of changing a few words in a poem or a song so that the seasons lined up a little bit better, changing the poppies from red to orange, whatever it was. It was that I realized in my limited knowledge at that time that I was working with different etheric forces, and that the children were learning and engaging with things like stories and inner picturing differently because, in part, I believe, of the quality of the light. In Sacramento, it pulls the children out quite significantly. There is a big difference between being on a busy city street and being on a river in terms of the movement of energy. And the actual, I couldn't make sense of this yet, but the geology. Rudolf Steiner School is in New York, which is granite. It gives a certain formative force. And these children, I think, because of their lives, had a tremendous capacity for inner picturing. In Sacramento, everything is more surface, it's alluvial, it's had the impact of gold mining right up to the edge of the property, and it's as if the energy was constantly moving out and downstream. Very, very interesting for me. So this question, we have a universal approach. We at least in my early years of Waldorf education, we did a little bit have the idea, we talked about the universal human being. we had the idea of the curriculum that we sort of put in place. And I believe we have slowly and painfully learned that certainly one size can't fit all and that we have to adapt for place. And so we have this fascinating experience of this universal approach now really and globally now, of course, encountering huge geographic, human, and cultural variation. This also turned me, I will also say, this question about adaptation, I think, is coming into its own, has come into its own for a bunch of reasons over the last decade. But my attention was also taken by Reggio Emilia, the Reggio Emilia education, which has gained a lot of traction in this country in the last several years. It's quite a strong influence, particularly in early childhood education. It's been adopted by school districts, it's in universities, and it's growing. But speaking with my Reggio Emilia colleagues, I noticed they always talked about Reggio Emilia inspired. And so I asked one, I had a conversation with her earlier this year, and you probably already all know this, but it was interesting to me, particularly given the ongoing arguments in this country about what is and is not Waldorf education, that the founders of Reggio Emilia, of course, it was formed in Italy to meet the needs of the municipality of Reggio Emilia. And you can only be a Reggio Emilia school if you are situated in Reggio Emilia, because they see education as being related to context. Anywhere else that this approach goes, it is inspired by. Just an interesting thought. It would have saved us a lot of time in this country, but that's a different presentation. But an interesting thought that they link it strongly to its founding place. So this question of what are we seeing in sometimes collision between a formed conventional approach to Waldorf education and where our schools have ended up as this has moved out into the world more beyond its European foundations. Next slide. This inevitably takes us to questions that, again, social justice questions that have been very prominent in our awareness, rightfully, at least for the last 15 years. And that we see when we're talking about the location of schools, if we believe that location matters, that the question of where our schools are becomes very important. And there are all sorts of layerings of meaning here. Now, it was mentioned by one of our South African friends last week that Waldorf schools historically there and in this country have been in places of privilege. Middle class to upper middle class locations, typically. And it was mentioned last week that, of course, is an issue for access. Who is in the schools and how do we work with that? I would say we continue to struggle with that. And because our public schools were founded initially where there was knowledge of Waldorf education, that tended to be true initially for the public schools as well, although that has been changing over time as we have spread out. I may have my math wrong, and I see Melanie Reiser was on, so she can correct me, but I tried to add up where we have both public and independent Waldorf schools, and I believe we are in at least 36 of the United States in a really, really wide variety of locations, a wide variety of opportunities. And we have in the background here, again, in this country, I can only speak specifically of where schools are has been a political statement that a school, an under-resourced school in an underserved neighborhood is markedly and often more run down, has fewer poor outdoor space, maybe next to industrial sites, etc. So there is a huge difference in the opportunity for enriched outdoor education, for facilities, etc. This was picked up by John Goodlad, a major study on schools in this country. It hasn't changed that much in 30 years. This picture of different resources, as well as all the wonderful work that's going on, and that ultimately our schools and the success of our young people on average in schools reflect these socioeconomic, political, and placement factors that impact our schools. And I just put these two pictures side by side. These are both Waldorf schools. The one on the left is a public, so I will say Waldorf inspired. They're about to go through their membership process. It's in Greater Los Angeles. And what is striking about this school is that the district didn't want it particularly. So they gave them one of the worst sites I've ever seen. It has a lot of blacktop surfaces. It has a big metal fence down the middle between two parts of the school. It shares the campus. And worst of all, if you look in the background here, beyond the struggling tree, that is a garbage dump. So huge trash collecting trucks come and go right past the school all day long. And you can imagine the environment that creates. And so they are having to carve out an appropriate space for the children. On the right is the school that I spent 21 years at, the Sacramento Waldorf School, and that is just a small summer glimpse of their working biodynamic farm that the children get to work in. It's right there on campus. It's beautiful, extraordinary. And the river is just beyond it. So, and if we could just look at the next slide. These are all Waldorf schools in the United States, or images from Waldorf schools in the United States. The top left is actually the school that was brought to us, the Community School for Creative Education, Ida Oberman's, the school that she founded. There is no green space. Now you can see those children are pretty happy and engaged. No green space, this attempt to have a few things growing in a tub there. It fronts right onto a busy street, and there's not the opportunity of an immediately available safe local park or anything. So they are working with that condition. Top right, Florida. Surf Club. It's a school early in its iteration. These are all public Waldorf schools because I had those pictures available, but I could easily give you a catalog. In the early days of the school, before it got too big, they all regularly went surfing. But this opportunity of the beach, the learning from a beach environment. Bottom left, northern New Hampshire, where they have land that includes rocks, trees, snow, and they are very focused on outdoor education. The kindergarten, early childhood spends most of its time outside. They're out in all weathers, and there's a huge emphasis on outdoor activity. Bottom right is, believe it or not, just to confuse you, in Arizona. And Arizona is a very interesting state because it has vast differences from north to south, but children playing in snow. So that's just a tiny picture because there is such a wide range of settings, of locations, of place in the United States that it's actually rather hard to comprehend if you have not lived here, and not just lived here, but traveled and seen this variety, which I am now fortunate to regularly do. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. And I'm now turning to this question of what do we know and how do we know it when we are engaging with place? And I'm treading carefully here, and you will see that this one does not have pictures because I think right now we are really in this country, and I know other countries are either, well, much further through it than us or just beginning this question of our relationship to Indigenous wisdom, to the first people, the Indigenous people, old ways of knowing. And of course, this is a profoundly different relationship to the land. And in this country and in other countries that were, I'm going to use the word colonized, because that's certainly what I grew up with, we have this imposition of a foreign culture onto what historically was there. And significant and conscious attempts over time to remove what was there, whether it was language practices, land ownership. And we see Truth and Reconciliation in South Africa. We see the reconciliation work in Canada, the treaty work in New Zealand. the work to work with the Aboriginal population in Australia in an attempt to understand this and to work with it. But my best understanding of this, and again, I am being careful because I think this is a delicate and complicated topic right now, is that beneath these attempts at suppression, we have a deep, deep lived knowledge of place, of connection, of sustainability, and of the use of natural resources. So as we look to the future, we know that this is going to be very, very important. The primary difference, my understanding, between Indigenous relationship to the land and a more so-called modern relationship to the land is the colonial or modern approach was extractive. What is the earth giving us that we can take and use? And the Indigenous way, no matter where it is in the world, is reciprocal. How do we work with? How do we honor and respect? And I find this principle of the seventh generation, which came from the Haudenosaunee people, the Iroquois, that as we make decisions, we need to consider not just now, we need to look back. How did we get here? And we need to look forward seven generations. I think that's important in Waldorf education. We know from Steiner, he talks about, this very frightening thought, I think, awe-inspiring thought, that we're not really seeing the impact of our teaching right now. It will show up in our students more in their 40s and 50s. Huge feeling of responsibility that comes with that I think awakens us to this idea of responsibility with how we live with nature. This idea from Kimmerer, Braiding Sweetgrass, which is a popular book on indigeneity in this country right now. The idea that we take only what we need, that we give thanks, that we understand that life is a gift, and that we honor it. And then just again, I showed you the picture of the snow in Arizona. Arizona is a very interesting example of collision of cultures and a sense of place. If you travel in Arizona, what comes to mind is those huge saguaro cacti and the heat and the light. And it's interesting that Phoenix in Arizona is one of the fastest growing cities in this country. People keep moving there. There's not enough water. And this past summer, they had over 100 days in a row with temperatures of over 100 degrees, which is 38 degrees Celsius. And yet, with this feeling that it's not quite permanent, there's this idea that survival is maybe just below the surface. There's evidence of indigenous people living there sustainably for over 13 to 15,000 years. So we need to be paying attention, I believe, in our schools to this question of what is the local indigenous wisdom, what is the local history, and what are indigenous ways of knowing. Next slide, please. And yet, how do we do this? I said I'm speaking carefully here because I am not indigenous. I in any place. I did not grow up with indigenous practices. In fact, I grew up with a country that was doing its best when I was growing up to suppress the indigenous people. So how do we tap in? If you have seen emails from people in this country right now, Zoom aspects, you'll often see something called a land acknowledgement on the land of the unceded land of a tribe or people. Land acknowledgements are often given at the beginning of conferences. I can think of other practices. New Zealand is probably the one I know best, where there is a Maori greeting at the beginning, a ceremonial opening, a respect now for where we stand. I think this is important for our children. I think it's a sign that we're wrestling with this, and it's clearly not sufficient on its own. And I think we have to be careful that this does not become the newest solution, but that we work with this respectfully. We ask local people how we can work with their cultures, with their knowledge, and we know, at least in this country, it's no longer just going to be given. We need to be reciprocal and be giving back. But to develop our understanding of place, at least in this country, requires engagement with Indigenous knowledge. And of course, if we radiate it out into Europe more, the source of this education, what is the equivalent? Because indigeneity is maybe not the right concept, but ancient wisdom, ancient ways of being with the land, ancient signs, sacred sites, etc., certainly are part of our relationship to place. How well do we know them? How well do we understand this long history of human engagement with the land? Along with that, I've just called this moving beyond Grimm. Grimm's fairy tales are wonderful. They're fantastic. As a young teacher, it was really my only option. In first grade, you did Grimm's. They carry incredibly important archetypes and pictures of the human being. And they are situated in Europe. Because they have archetypes, it's not specific. We're not specifically walking through the Black Forest or wherever we happen to be, but they give a particular place-based, they come out of a folk tradition. So are we able to build our canon, our collection of traditional folk tales, stories, traditions, arts, crafts, etc., that are local, that build, in addition to Grimm, which means we have to let some go, that build a sense of place, of local grounding for our students. And can we, through our practices, combine ancient and indigenous and modern relationships to the land? Why I said I think we have to be careful that it's not just the latest trend or answer, because we're looking for answers, is this respectful knowledge that most of us are not Indigenous. But we do come out of historical and ancient trends, and what is still living, can we be sensitive to it in space and out of our own biography of place so we can call on it? And then I just added a tiny excerpt from these words spoken by a Hopi elder that were given back at the beginning of this century, looking at this future. So it's a prophecy statement with this statement, okay, we are in for a time of challenge, and that is certainly proving to be true. And again, coming back to your place biography, inviting us to ask ourselves some questions. Where are you living? So to me, that is do I have a relationship to where I am living? Do I understand my place? What are you doing? What are your relationships? And that includes relationship to self, to other human beings, and to the land. Are you in right relation? What's the condition of your relationships? Where is your water? Symbolic, but increasingly important in real life in this time. And this instruction to know your garden. And if I take garden, the source of life, of food, and to go forward with this, that we can't stop it. So when I look at developing indigeneity, I think our challenge is to work respectfully with Indigenous knowledge and to ground ourselves and to not appropriate it in ways that are not authentic. We need to find a modern way of working with this. Okay, so moving on to the next slide. So this, of course, I've used the words colonizing and decolonizing a few times. A lot of work is happening. and it's come up many times in this series about localizing the curriculum, about taking the so-called curriculum, about working with generative principles, about really looking at what the children need. And I'm just bringing this one. I'm not going to talk a lot about decolonizing work today. It's not my topic. But this one I would love to hear about when we get to discussion. Three of these are Waldorf schools, and one is a traditional English village. If I go to, I tested and I didn't find anyone that disproved this. If I go to a site for Waldorf education in this country and I look at images, I will almost certainly find a picture of Maypole. And in all my years, and I have nothing against May Day and the Maypole, but in all my years of Waldorf education, this has always puzzled me, as how did this particular festival become ingrained in United States Waldorf education? It's beloved, it's practiced. If you look at the top left picture there, that is a school in Kona, Hawaii. How do they make sense of this? And as a school administrator, I wrote lovely articles to the parents about it. I talked about it. I can see the layers of meaning in it. Yet I'm using this just as one example of things that become, I know Christoph has done some work around the sacred nothings, Stephen Sagarin about Waldorf myths, things that become very symbolic, that are not of place or time. It doesn't mean they're wrong if we have good reasons for them. But this, to me, as I thought about it, was just a striking example of place-based, localized education. So I will be curious to know, is this universal or is this a United States thing? Okay, next slide, please. So I'm moving now a little bit. I mentioned early on that I have had the good fortune in my exploration of this to spend a few days at Ruskin Mill. And one of the first things I did there was I was taken on what they call a genius loci walk. And this is the beginning of that walk up through the valley at the Ruskin Mill School College. And so genius loci, I think, is really important for us in Waldorf education. It literally means the spirit of a place. It goes back to Roman culture at least. And it really is a way of looking at the geology, the water, the plants, the animals, and human history, and starting to understand what their essence are and how they have developed and the spirit of a place, using deep observation, immersion in a place, interacting with it, research on things like history, understanding the local community and culture, to really build a deep understanding and relationship to place. It's used quite widely in architecture. And so now, next slide, I'm going to switch for this last little bit to my very initial understanding of the Ruskin Mill approach. And again, I want to be really careful. There's a danger, especially as it's now the third time of bringing this, that we say, okay, here's the newest thing. But I do believe if we are asking this question of what is working and where are we seeing success and where are we seeing something that is very actively addressing the needs of students and schools and teachers that I began with, we should be paying attention here. So their goal, as it says here, is using education, and they are very clear this is Waldorf-based education, with young people who have had profound challenges, who have not succeeded in the system, learning, behavioral, autism, etc., and they use the arts, crafts, agriculture, and environmental sciences. They are located very, very strongly in space. I was fortunate enough to visit 4 of their sites, and each one interpreted this approach differently, very much based on a site. They provide, so they're beyond a school, they provide holistic and therapeutic care. They emphasize things like nutrition, health. They have a lot of emphasis on practical skills, on training, and on therapeutic education, which includes movement. And as I have thought about this, I believe that they are engaged in these 3 things: restoration, redemption, and transformation. And it's not just for the individual young people who find their way there. It is also quite profoundly of the land, of local history, and of arts, crafts, and human culture. So again, to be careful that we're not just saying, okay, we should all do this, because there are reasons why we can't. I'd like to just pull out a few threads that I think are directly relevant to our discussion about Waldorf schools. By the way, the picture on this slide is of in Birmingham, so in a city, an old factory where they have a school, and this is a roof garden that they had to reinforce the building in order to have this roof garden. So next slide, because one of their fundamental ways of working is to work directly with the land, to work with plants, and to ensure that there are animals in whatever way is possible. So that the jewelry school on the last slide has bees. They use biodynamics on the land. Then this was mentioned maybe by Ruhi, this idea of the therapeutic power of animals, finding the right animals. This is Ruskin Mill College, which is in the Cotswolds, which is an old sheep and wool area. So they have sheep, many sheep. And this idea that the land, the plants, and the animals are going to be their source of materials. So they are talking about healing the land while they are healing the individual. They practice as much as possible field to fork nutrition, so the young people get healthy nutrition and understand this reciprocity that I spoke about in Indigenous cultures, and they understand the specific gifts and challenges and human history of the land. And of course, for those of you in Europe and England, there aren't too many pieces of the land that have not been worked and don't have human history in some way. So this idea of, it's interesting to me that we have found as our public Waldorf schools have grown, that one of the first things many of them do is establish some kind of garden. There's an understanding that this land connection is important for our young people. So working with the land is one that I think we need to look at from this model. It's not unique to this model, but they have taken it in a very conscious way. Next slide. The next is crafts, and each site that I went to emphasized different crafts based on the local resources and the local craft history. So they are engaged in really understanding the cultural and economic history. For example, the Glassworks School, they had people tutoring who were former glassblowers from factories that had closed down. Often crafts, of course, have closed, the production of crafts. This idea of local sourcing of materials. I was at a school in northern New Hampshire a few weeks ago, and the 6th grade went out to source clay for work that they were going to be doing, came back very happy and very dirty. And these local and culturally relevant activities and crafts, including these fibers, glass blowing, jewelry, forging, green woodworking, it's a whole range of them. It's quite fascinating. And this picture, I just wanted to mention because I spent a few hours at the Glassworks School, and they allowed me to sit in and watch this very large, powerful young man, student, who was working one-on-one with a glass-blowing tutor through this complicated, delicate process of glass blowing. And they had told me a little bit about his background, very troubled, had issues with anger and violence, etc., very troubled, and the progress he had made. And I watched him in this extraordinary, delicate dance with his tutor and with this molten glass. And I asked the person who was with me, how do they cope if it breaks? Asked it very quiet. I think I might have asked before I went in, like, what happens? These are young people with impulse control issues and all sorts of challenges. And they said it's part of the process. And so sure enough, as this young man had almost finished blowing this globe, beautiful colors, they'd done all of the stages, it shattered right in front of me. I was much more upset than he was. he very much saw it as part of the process. And for me, it was a picture of what we already know, the role of crafts in building resilience and resourcefulness and courage. And as I was leaving, he presented me with this. It's a piece of his work, which actually is very heavy, but which I managed to get back to California in one piece. So that, again, crafts, we have a craft curriculum. Does it need to become more prominent? Is it located enough in our local history and resources, or is it still an imported set of activities? Just something for us to look at. Next one, we're almost done. So this idea also of learning and growing in community, they see that everyone involved in the schools is developing together, which of course this lifetime of self-development is a principle of Waldorf education. They are very conscious that they are role models in healthy relationships, self-control, etc., self-management for these students. So there is this feeling of community. There is absolute emphasis on observation. Goethean observation, child study, observation of the land, research. This is their research center, the field center, where I very much hope to go back and spend more time. So there is space, resources, time, and attention given to this imperative for research. Action research is seen as their central mechanism because they're all engaged in the field. They have university and degree connections, and they are visible in the education culture and therapeutic culture of the United Kingdom. Next slide. So learning and growing in community seems to be a thread. Then this emphasis on the cycles of nature to help ground these young people with their very difficult pasts. Strong emphasis on the cycle of the year, the seasons, festivals that belong right in place and time, celebrations, drama, movement. So which festivals is our question in schools? Not do we have festivals, but which ones? Do they fit the season? And having grown up with the dislocation of Christmas with snowy scenes and heavy English food while it was hot outside, that no longer happens there. I understand that one deeply. This need to transform what we had to make it fit place. Process of transforming. And through all of this, I would say they are emphasizing things that, again, are strong in Waldorf education: the importance of ritual, of meaning making, and of building a sense of belonging. And the plant here, I was there in early spring. This is a natural small ground cover plant that is coming back. I can't remember the name of it. And the woman who took me on the walk said this is an ancient local plant, forest plant, and the fact that it's now growing so strongly is a evidence, so research evidence that our work on restoring the land matters. Next slide. This is wherever you go in these schools, you will see water. Flow forms, water feature, ponds, mills, whatever it happens to be. And this is a very modern water form. Is the center, I think, it's in the Glassworks School. But this idea that we are going to honor and really work with the spiritual scientific research, observation, practices of reflection. They incorporate eurythmy, which is one of my questions in this country when we look at Waldorf schools. This understanding of the healing power of water and bringing it into comprehensible form. Research papers, writing about it, putting it out there. But they are very clear that they are based on spiritual scientific research and the works of Rudolf Steiner. That is put right out there, which leads us to the next slide. This one I'm just putting because what fascinates me with the Ruskin Mill approach is that they are growing and seeing success at a time when several aspects of Waldorf education are going in the opposite direction from what I can see. They are fully publicly funded, and any student who comes in needs to go through full assessment and have, the proper paperwork to be able to be there, and then it's funded. Along with that, they are very, very clear about the needs for accountability. report filing, visits, official visits, etc., etc., etc. And they say this is this is our reciprocal relationship. So absolute clarity of the need for not just the spiritual work, but the very practical accountability. And this has been an issue, I would say, at least in this country, in Waldorf schools at times, with this idea that somehow we don't need to quite worry about things like that because we are doing our work. And that was compounded in this country because for many, many years, the independent schools had almost no, and I would say to this day, have almost no official oversight. And that is something that the public school movement has actually brought in much more. But this transparent, accessible communication, you can understand what they're doing and how they're talking about it. The need to be able to assess, and that is just part of the landscape, and a huge emphasis on health and safety, necessary because of the nature of these young people and their traumatized backgrounds very often. So security, safety, visitors, they maintain public pathways if they're there. They have good relationships as far as I can see with their surrounding communities, but they are wide awake on health and safety. And then just my last two slides really now. So next slide, really turn us back into, here's my biodynamic school again, how we apply this to Waldorf schools. Obviously, it's a different matter. We can't just say we're all doing a Ruskin Mill approach. We are schools in the main sector. They are special needs institutions. We have questions of scalability, of the underfunded resources in schools, and what is transferable. But I think there are some clues there. And I think some starting points for any school are in building a deeper understanding of the genius loci, things like land walks, local research, respectfully calling on elders from local tribes in this country, doing an audit, which has a whole lot of curriculum work that could come in. Imagine a botany audit in 5th grade, right in line with the curriculum, what's into 6th grade. There are all sorts of things that can be done, but really taking on our understanding of place, more local sourcing of resources, and what do the local resources suggest to us in terms of activity. I've already mentioned this idea of farming and gardening, and how much can we bring back local native vegetation as we work on our land, and engaging with our local community. Then the very last slide, some questions. This is Kona. They're out with tamarind plants, I believe they are, gathering them for a class. We should all be so lucky. This question I mentioned earlier, so eurythmy was considered by Steiner to be integral to Waldorf education. It is spiritually based education and movement. It brings, my understanding brings the spirit into form. It is central to Ruskin Mill approach. Many of our schools in this country do not have eurythmy, or have it on a very limited basis because there aren't enough eurythmists. What is the impact of that? Should we be also looking, and these are just questions, at local spiritually connected forms of movement such as hula, taiko drumming, local music and dance, folk dance? Where do they belong? Not as a replacement for eurythmy, but in our understanding of place. Who is working consciously? Where does the conscious work with the being of a school belong in a school? This is a big question in public education where it's hard to even talk about it. Does the spirit of our school have a home? Do we consciously create that and work very consciously with that? And then my last question before we make some time for all of us, I think this look at place, as I have been approaching it, suggests yet again that we need to challenge many of our assumptions about school itself. I think there are the model, the idea of school as we have known it is under interrogation now. And just as a question, as a Waldorf educator, how much as an educator did I ask the students to fit the model as I understood it? And how far did I adjust the model to fit the children? And this really comes out of Paulo Freire's work, liberatory pedagogy. But from that, what needs to change in that relationship? And I think there are some thoughts and threads in addressing that question through this investigation of place. So now I would be really interested to know what you think.
I was asking myself when you brought this question that there is a quality in the indigenous culture to relate to the place, a special spiritual quality. And this is quite true. And the moment when I go to maybe to the US, especially in the western part, you feel it in the nature. You feel that the nature speaks to you in a different way than I have experienced it. And of course, from a European perspective, we don't know about indigenous culture in Europe, so to speak. So we
Yes.
have this is our landscape, how we experience it. Maybe the woods, it's something connected to the Brother Grimm tales. So this is it's always the perception of a culture which
Yep.
relates us to nature, to a place. So I'm now in Kassel. It's a totally cultural, geographical place which is formed by the Brother Grimm, for example. And also, when you take the Goethean approach, it could be a modern approach to relate to a place, because if you go into his poems and into his travel journals, he always tries out of observation to really touch the essence of a place in a very peculiar way. And yeah, this would be my question. What can we do in Europe where this given spirituality, so to speak, is no longer present, but a cultural developed spirituality, so to speak, is there? Just some thinking on this. It's a very interesting aspect, I think, for education, because we all know that within our biography, we are so much formed and touched throughout our life by the places where we are living, where we have spent our childhood time and so on. It's part of our soul, and sometimes it reveals its power quite later in life, not in the moment we are connected. So it's really an interesting aspect. And how can we do it of course, in a liberal way, this is our task as teachers, to have it as an offer, not to that the students can have a feeling connection to the place where they are. Yeah.
Yeah, Liz, I have a little problem. You brought so much important issues in such a high speed.
Uh-oh, sorry.
That I'm a little bit speechless, because all the aspects you brought are so important, and to discuss them deeply if we want to develop an idea about the future of our schools. So I'm a little bit speechless. But from the Ruskin Mill side, I know Ruskin Mill very well. There you see, that's as I have experienced it. There you see a modern way of looking into the future.
Yeah.
That's not so based on indigenous qualities. That is very much based on a modern spirituality, and of course based on the genius of Angus Gordon. And by a lot of the questions you brought this evening, I always ask myself, yeah, who takes it up? Where are the people who do it? And so, for example, years ago, I was in California, and I showed the teachers the possibility to avoid the fourth grade mythology storytelling about the North mythology. And I showed them how they can find the archetypal stories in their own come in their own legends over there, and that they could that they are nearly had equivalent to the Norse mythologies, and still today they use the Norse mythology. So, what is the problem? I guess the curriculum that Steiner designed for the Waldorf school was precisely for the place in that part of Europe.
Yeah.
So how we remodel the curriculum for the places where the schools are, that's for me a kind of a central question. Do you understand what I mean? Yes, huh?
I do, and I see it. I mean, that was one of the reasons I put those pictures of the maypole.
Yeah.
As just one very silly, it's not that we shouldn't do a maypole.
Yeah, yeah.
But the maypole, in a way, for me, is a symbol. I don't know whether it's based on fear that we've got to do it right. I mean, to me, Waldorf education is really strong. I don't think we're going to break it by doing the research we need to do to ask what the children need.
Yeah.
I do think we have a big problem with the children who are presenting now asking for something different.
Yeah.
And I think we have to go local to meet that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I somehow...
First, Sven.
I wonder if one of the least helpful things in Waldorf reality is the word tradition. And a superficial listening to what you said, Liz, could make one believe that this is something to be cherished, because of course, if we root ourselves into our local place, in our local history, then the word tradition is literally just around the corner. And the moment we have that, I think things become written down, become written in stone. And we no longer do what Steiner asks us to do as free spirits, which is to make absolutely original decisions that are not based on what other people did before us, nor what we've been commanded to do. And yet, I have yet to find a Waldorf school, certainly a recognized official Waldorf school, that doesn't pride itself on its traditions.
Yeah.
But I will talk about that next week, because I think the question, what actually gets in the way, what stops us from being innovative, we don't have to look much beyond those traditions with a capital T.
It's on the point, 9 o'clock. Do you want to say something for the end?
I think Robert said it for us. How do we bring not just the places we've lived, which is this idea of understanding our own personal relationship to space and place, but the place where we are into our teaching? I think that's the key question, and it is an open question for me.
All the best to all of you. Thank you again, Liz, and happy to see you next week again. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Many thanks to everyone.
Thank you, Liz.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.